It is indeed time for Cross Question. I'm Ben Kentish here on LBC 8:02 the time, and joining me in the studio for tonight's Cross Question are Jim Shannon, the DUP MP for Strangford and Party's Health and Care spokesperson. Richard Foord is here, Liberal Democrat MP for Tiverton and Honiton, and the Lib Dem Defence spokesperson. Tessa Dunlop joins me, the historian and author, as does Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the anti-extremism think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, you're also a Conservative councillor. If you've got a question to put to our panel, call now. 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Ben Kentish. This is LBC.
Right, let's get straight to our first question, which tonight comes from Stephen in East Grinstead. Stephen, good evening.
Hi, good evening, Ben. Good evening, panel. Are Boris Johnson, the DUP and ERG plotting to stop the Prime Minister's NI deal?
Stephen, thank you. Very topical, very relevant. Jim Shannon, are you and your party and the ERG planning to stop Rishi Sunak's Northern Ireland deal?
It's no secret that the ERG and the DUP have regular contact, but the fact is, no, we're not plotting. But what we are is seeking for a way forward that ensures that the unionist people, which I represent in Northern Ireland, have a say in the process. The reason why I say that is quite simple. Both Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, both very prominent in the peace process and the agreement for Northern Ireland, both said that unionists must be part of that process. So we need to be part of that process. At this moment in time, the agreement, as indicated by Rishi, we're not entirely convinced that it's reached the levels that perhaps he thinks it has. So we have employed a number of barristers to look at the small print. The small print's the devil's in the detail, as a man would say, or the lady would say. So I think it's important that we look at that detail, and we're doing that. And then whenever we've done that, then we as a party will decide collectively, as a party with the executive and with the DUP MPs, whether or not we will support it. So I think that's where we are. Plotting. I'm not a plotter, but I am a person who seeks truth and honesty, and I think that's where I'm coming from.
You say you're not convinced, Jim. I understand you want to see the detail. At this moment in time, as we speak tonight, are you more minded to support it or more minded to oppose it?
I think I would withhold my fire at this moment in time. I'm sorry to step sideways on it, but I think to be fair, to the Prime Minister, and he's got certainly got, I don't know what he's on, but he's certainly very enthusiastic about it. But I would be enthusiastic if there was more detail and more evidence based analysis on where we are. I'm not convinced that that's the case. So we will, as I said before, we'll want to take a legal opinion. We're then going to bring it before our party officers and the DUP MPs. Then and only then will we make that decision. Now, whether that'll be white smoke or no smoke, here's the question for you.
Jim, thank you. Let's go to Richard. Is this a good deal? Jim doesn't sound convinced. Are you?
Well, I think, Ben, it is a little bit early to say for the Liberal Democrats also, in the sense we need to see what the details have to say. I mean, clearly Jim is of Northern Ireland and I am not, so immediately I would defer to people who live in Northern Ireland. We also do have a sister party in the Liberal Democrats, that's the Alliance Party. Mm. So we speak often with Stephen Farry, the MP from the Alliance Party. I mean, our initial impressions are that it's a pragmatic approach, and that's to be welcome, particularly in a place where there has been real discord in the past. Pragmatism is key to having successful outcomes in the Northern Ireland. I've no doubt. We do have some concerns over the Stormont break, but only insofar as we want this to appeal to all of the parties in Northern Ireland.
Alan? Your thoughts on what Rishi Sunak announced yesterday?
Well, I think it's a great deal in the sense that we appear to have made significant progress from where we were, of course, at this point of terrible impasse where we had neither a protocol that was working, some sense of a future that was going to be sensible in Northern Ireland, and relations with the EU were in tatters. Suddenly, because of this approach, this careful, considered approach, I think we see at least the green shoots here of a solution. It may well be that the DUP and others have reservations. I'm sure they'll look at it in the round and go, well, can we really get something better than this? Is this not realistic, the best sort of deal we can get? Because let's remember what it agrees on. It says that Northern Ireland will be now treated as part of the UK for much of, almost all, 97% at least of things will be the same as the UK. There's a Stormont break that gives Northern Irish parties the ability, at least, for the first time to object and for this to then be brought out there. Those seem to be very significant things. And I think we should, in one sense, pay tribute to the Prime Minister for his careful and considered approach in getting some kind of deal with the Europeans on this, who appear to have embraced that as well. And I think that's very different to what we saw with Boris Johnson, where it was a lot of no. It's very different to what David Frost couldn't get a deal with. Liz Truss didn't have time to get a deal of any kind, but he's gone out there and spent his time going out there, building bridges and gaining a rapprochement. And I think that's really significant and could really bode well for the UK and Northern Ireland, of course, within the UK going forward.
It's pitiful, really, in some ways, I think, if I just jump in, that now Northern Ireland has what we once all had in 2016, at least if you believe the top line that Rishi Sunak is so heavily selling today. In fact, he called Northern Ireland the world's, I think, most exciting economic zone. And I'm like, what have they got? What have they got? Oh, they've got access to the single market in the EU. And they can trade in Britain. That's where we were in 2016. And I wonder, Jim, what you expected when you, as a man born and brought up in Northern Ireland, MP for Strangford, no less, what you expected when you voted Brexit. You must have seen this coming down the tracks. Even I could see it, and I'm not from Northern Ireland.
Well, I will say that whenever Boris Johnson was at our party conference and whenever some of my colleagues were cheering him to the high rafters, I'm not smarter than anybody else, far from it, but I'm a good judge of character. And I wouldn't have been the person cheering like everyone else was and how fantastic this was. Boris makes his own mind off.
Yeah, but let's forget Boris for a sec. Go to 2016. Yeah. What did you see? Did you see a hard border between you and the South?
No, we expected the 2016. We expected to have the same as the rest of Great Britain and Scotland and Wales. I mean, I always use this phrase. It's a very applicable phrase. Margaret Thatcher said it way back in the 80s. She says now that Northern Ireland and Ulster is as British as Finchley. Well, just at this moment in time, I don't feel as British as Finchley. And I didn't. I hoped that I would be as British as Finchley in 2016 when the referendum came through, but today I don't, and I don't feel, with respect, I don't feel as confident as perhaps you do, and there's no reason why the interpretations can be different. I try to base my interpretations on fact, so the facts are that we're not as British.
But are you a wee bit worried that if you go back into Stormont, you're going to be the second party, aren't you now, to Sinn Féin? You're going to lose your agency. Is there a little bit of stalling here? You're going to spend ages and ages with your lawyers going over these pages of detail. I don't envy you, by the way, but there's a little bit of you withholding, because once you get into Stormont, you're not the big boys anymore.
We're still the big boys in unionism, and that's let's remember who we are, you know. And as far as I'm concerned, I see that. Do I have any concerns personally over? I served in the Assembly for 12 years, by the way. So I was part of that DUP team that agreed at the Northern Ireland Assembly. We had to come to a position of sharing power, and I understood that. And I accept that. So if they have a mandate that's bigger than our mandate for a short period of time, I'm quite happy with that. I have no problems whatsoever. The DUP don't fear it. We represent the voice of unionism. We will continue to do so, and we will do that to the best of our ability.
But on the point that Tessa's making, Jim, it's effectively that you might not like every element of this deal, but you as a party are going to come under enormous pressure to step back up to the table and form a power-sharing agreement and government at Stormont, aren't you?
Well, I mean, we haven't got that stage yet. We love pressure, by the way. I mean, nothing thrills me as much.
But how long can you continue to be the barrier to a functioning government in Northern Ireland?
We have an agreement that Rishi, the Prime Minister, has reached with the EU. We have to do an analysis of that. We have to have a very clinical legal opinion, and their barristers will do that for us. We expect that back fairly quickly, I would have thought.
This week?
That's more likely to be next week.
You've got to see the irony, though, Jim. There's loads of businesses on mainland Britain thinking, James, I wish I was in Northern Ireland so I could whap stuff across the border. And there you are digging your heels in as the DUP.
No, we're not digging our heels in. We seek justice. We seek what's right and what's honest. And I've always been my way of doing things all my life. I push for what's right. And when something's wrong, I'll state that as well.
I would say, Tessa, though, not all businesses will be rubbing their hands at the prospect of investing, because what this does also bring is an uncertain investment climate. There's going to be no certainty about how much Northern Ireland will be having its regulations that are matching those in the UK as against those in the European Union. And business wants, above all, certainty.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you could hear the oversell in Rishi's voice. I don't doubt that. And without a trace of irony, incidentally.
Just going back to the question, Stephen also asked about Boris Johnson, whether he is plotting to block this. Alan, I said on the show yesterday, I think he's got an egg on his face. He looks a bit silly because what Rishi Sunak has done here is deliver a far better deal than he was ever able to do. Do you think this is at least one nail in the coffin of Boris Johnson's political comeback?
I don't think there are any nails in his coffin about anything like this. I think, Boris is a contortionist who is able to come back and forth in any which way, because essentially he is very good at framing issues at the time. So I wouldn't look at this in terms of, Boris up, Rishi, Boris down, Rishi up in that sort of way. I would look at it in the way you've suggested, which is that the current Prime Minister has gone and got a deal that his predecessors have not managed to get, one of whom, of course, orchestrated the whole thing originally, knowing he was going to basically rat on it down the line. And I think rather than making comparisons between the two of them, I think, Rishi has made the point quite clearly. He said, look, this isn't about personality. This is about getting a deal that works, which I think I've done. And can we just talk about the merits of the deal rather than what X or Y might do it? I do think what is interesting is that Boris, if there was some sense that he might have used this as an opportunity to stir, that's clearly gone.
But he did. He did it last week. He was warning the DUP apparently to be cautious.
Look at how many Conservatives have come on side publicly. People
yes, and he looks
Baker,
silly.
Chris Heath, people who were previously on his
Boris
side.
Johnson looks isolated and, dare I say, looks a bit silly.
Well, I think he has made a mistake here in thinking that this would be the ditch to die in, if that's the case. But I think, actually, if you look, he did make a little intervention, but he's pulled back from that. I think he's very astute tactically, and his position is, right, I can see the way this is going. Maybe there'll be some, kind of ructions in Ulster still. There might well be. But, realistically, when you look at the names who've come on board already, this is not going to be the sort of dramatic, kind of sundering of the Conservative Party that it might have been last week, people thought.
Tessa, do you think this damages Boris Johnson, or is Alan right? He's irrelevant to all this, effectively.
He looks like a wounded, and I agree, slightly less relevant beast. What I felt was less that the whole bunch of the ERG and the people on the right are thinking this is a great deal, and more that they're sniffing in the wind. Their seats might be imperiled in an election that isn't so far away. So there's a lot of opportunism about getting in behind this deal. People, when they feel insecure about their jobs, quite quickly change their tune. Suddenly that 5-year term in 2019 is looking much, much smaller and much more imperiled. The one person who's come out of this well, I've got to say, is Rishi. He's got something that separates him from the Johnson administration, and he shows that he can strike a different tone with Europe, and about time too. I mean, how long were we going to go on falling out with our nearest neighbours?
But Tessa, let's not forget that Sunak was on board with this whole project, right? So when that trade and cooperation agreement was signed in 2020, Sunak was cheerleading from number 11 Downing Street. And what we found about that trade deal is that it was a botched trade deal between the UK and the European Union. It's the feedback that I get in my constituency from farmers who have just really struggling with the additional red tape, the small businesses who are having to go through all sorts of hurdles to sell into the EU in a way that they didn't before. When Alan talks about Sunak mending bridges, we need to remember why those bridges were broken in the first place.
Yeah. Richard, no.
I mean, he's a marked man, Rishi Sunak, but he's making a fist of a bad job. He's got a poison chalice,
But
let's be honest.
on that, Richard, no great surprise that you think Brexit was a mistake. What is the Lib Dem party policy on it? Would you seek to rejoin the European Union?
Well, there's no surprises that the Liberal Democrats are a very pro-European party, but we've got to work with the situation that we find ourselves in. The country voted in a particular way in 2016, and that has changed the dynamic between the UK and the European Union.
So you don't think we should rejoin?
There's no prospect right now of us rejoining the European Union. There's no offer. I mean, the relations between the UK and the Union...
If Ed Davey was Prime Minister, would he go knocking on Ursula von der Leyen's door saying, we want to come back?
It's not an offer.
But would he ask for it?
It's just not available. We've already diverged in a way that it means that we don't have the deal on offer that we had before.
No, but we've got horrific economics, haven't we? I mean, this week, Keir Starmer, with a degree of credibility, I mean, he was pulling on some curious statistics, but he was saying, Poland's economy is going to overtake us in 2030, then Romania and Bulgaria's in 2040. There is a great deal of truth. What's their commonality? What's their common factor since 2010? And what's our narrative been? And actually, our economy shrunk by 4%. That's going to be very hard to sell to the great British constituency, which is no longer 50% plus pro this Brexit deal.
We've got so much that we could improve on. There's so much we could improve on about current trading relations between the UK and the EU. And research was covered yesterday in the Prime Minister's statement. That is an area that is absolutely crying out for better cooperation between the UK and the EU.
OK, Jim, I do want to ask you about Boris Johnson, but we'll do that in just a moment. You're listening to LBC. I'm Ben Kentish. The time now, 8:18.
LBC.
The time you're listening to LBC. I'm Ben Kentish, and joining me in the studio for Cross Questions tonight are Jim Shannon, the DUP MP for Strangford, Richard Foord, the Liberal Democrat MP for Tiverton and Honiton, Tessa Dunlop, the historian and author, and Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, Alan Mendoza. A reminder, if you've got a question for the panel, call us now, 0345 6060 973. We're going to come to our next question in just one moment, but we were talking just a moment ago about Boris Johnson and his role in potential potentially trying to squash Rishi Sunak's Northern Ireland agreement. Jim, I just want to ask you briefly before we move on. It had been reported that Boris Johnson is urging your party to be cautious about this. What has he said to you in private?
I'm not aware that Boris he certainly hasn't said it to me in private, but he may have had some conversations with our leader, Jeffrey Dawson. I suspect he has. Look, we're not going to be swayed by Boris. Boris is a great guy. There's absolutely no doubt about it. He's sorry. One of the senior MPs said to me one night at the dinner table, he looked across at me over his glasses, not mentioning he owned a sizable portion of Norfolk, I think. But he looked at me and he says to me, he says, well, Jim, what do you think of Boris? I says, well, to be honest with you, I'd love to go to dinner with Boris. Boris would be great fun. But if he's handed me a contract which he signed across the table, I wouldn't believe it.
He's not someone you trust.
Personally,
you'd have an affair with him, but you wouldn't get married.
I think the affair would be a stage too far for this old boy.
So he's not somebody that you would trust.
He's all things to all men. Nice fella.
But would you trust him?
Well, we've been let down, haven't we? You know?
So you wouldn't trust him?
So the answer was it'd be very difficult to trust him, yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Another call on this. This is from Ben in Clacton. Ben, hello.
Hello. I was born in Northern Ireland, so I'm fortunate enough to have an Irish passport as well as a British passport. And I've got the best of both worlds. And does the panel agree with me that if this agreement goes through, it will make a united Ireland much less likely because the population of Ireland will be happy where they are?
Okay, thank you. Ben, thank you very much. Richard?
I think whatever we do, we've got to have as our anchor here the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. There's no small reason why Tony Blair felt the hand of history on his shoulder back in 1998. Decades and decades of violence, and we've seen the cessation of violence, and we don't, I think, take a pause and reflect enough just what a great achievement that was for John Major and Blair after him. So whatever we do, we have to keep all of the communities satisfied with the arrangements in Northern Ireland. In my personal opinion, that was easier when there was shared identity, and people could feel themselves both Northern Irish, British, Irish, but European. And that's easy when you've got these shared identities. And I think it does become a little bit more difficult when you go back to having single identities again.
Okay. Jim Shannon.
I'm always minded whenever Tony Blair said I'm not one for a catchphrase, but I think, Dr. Paisley, that I feel the hand of history on your shoulder, But anyway, being facetious, maybe being a wee bit cruel, maybe with that comment. Look, United Ireland's no closer to the day than it was when I was a wee boy, and that wasn't yesterday. The fact of the matter is that the latest NOP's national opinion polls indicate that there's a large proportion of those who would come perhaps from a nationalist background are not committed. They don't see their future necessarily with a United Ireland. I'm probably fortunate in life that my dad came from Donegal in the Republic of Ireland. My mother outside Strabane. They got together a long time ago. But my dad left Donegal, and he left it for a reason. He left it because there was a level of persecution, a level of deprivation, a level of focus upon those of a Protestant relation and religion, and he moved to the very east of the province where we settled and where I've lived for all but 4 years of my life. I think the point I'm making is that I don't see United Ireland any closer today than it has been.
But Ben's question was, does this deal, which you're still not sure if you're going to support, he says if it works, if people in Ireland back it, then it will make a united Ireland even less likely.
I think a United Ireland's already less likely. That's the point I'm making, because the national opinion polls that we have in Ireland and Northern Ireland indicate that. So I'm just quoting the facts, But
you're being a wee bit disingenuous, aren't you? I mean, there were two nations within the Great British nest, and that was Scotland and Northern Ireland, who didn't back Brexit, majority didn't back Brexit. And we've seen in Scotland how this has allowed the SNP to restart their Indie Ref 2 narrative.
Oh, that train's fallen off its rails.
Temporarily, but actually a lot of people would argue...
Independence movements go through spasms. You know that. Look at Quebec.
Okay,
Quebec's
so there has been an Indie Ref 2 spasm in the wake of this this Brexit, take back control. Well, what about our say in Scotland? It's given it oxygen. And it would be naive to suggest that Northern Ireland hasn't been given pause for thought about its relationship. And therefore, the quicker you get back into Stormont, even your leader today, he's a devolutionist. He admitted he was. Well, get cracking.
No, we're not cracking anywhere until we get what we need, the evidence we need. We need to look at it. I'm going to be clinical in our.
Why is the protocol a barrier to forming a government at Stormont?
Well, I mean, at this moment in time, the issue really is Rishi's deal. That's where we are at this moment in time. We've got to look at that and make a very, very clear, deliberate way. Look,
but why can't you oppose the deal if you decide to do so while also forming part of a government at Stormont?
Well, the reason why we withdrew from the Assembly was because we had foisted upon us the. Boris Johnson's ultimately they bordered down the RAC. We didn't agree with that. It was very clear we didn't. We had to use a method which we had for us, and that was to withdraw our representation from Stormont. We're not the first party to do that. Sinn Féin did it for 3 years. Let's be honest. I mean, parties on occasions will use what they have as a methodology to achieve a goal.
So it's a bargaining chip, effectively.
No, and you've done really well. You've drawn all these concessions out of the EU. I mean, you've played it.
No. There's a terrible mistake.
What concessions?
If I may,
what
concessions? You had a moment when you really could have shaped everything. 2017 to 19, you had the balance of power in your party, and I hate to say it, but you blew it. And I've got the greatest respect for unionism but you blew it. You had the chance to shape a deal to your liking and you didn't go there. And now there is a sense of maybe we made a mistake. I think that we should have looked back when we had that ability to really shape UK policy. We didn't do it.
Well, no, actually, I can. I see things probably very simply, and forgive me for being that type of person. We didn't have anything in 2017-19 that gave us any confidence that we were going to be in a position where we would be better off than what we were. We had a deal with and by the way, my politics is left of centre. It's no secret, and so for me personally, it was a big deal, and I had to work out where I was, and Jeffrey had spoken to me on a personal business occasion about that. But that's by the way. The point I'm making is this: we had a $2 billion a deal with the Conservatives. We delivered, and the Conservatives delivered that $2 billion for the people of Northern Ireland. So it was a financial agreement which they delivered on, and we made sure that our constituents across all of Northern Ireland, both from all sides, received the same benefits. Look, in 2019, Boris then achieved a Brexit of sorts, not the Brexit that we wanted, not the Brexit I voted for. I'm always very mindful.
I'm still not sure about what Brexit you did vote for. That you didn't envisage a hard border with the Republic. If you didn't want to see something with the trading with the UK, I don't get it. I don't get what was in your head. Unicorns.
I'm certainly not a unicorn. I would say that in 2019 we were done over. That's just a fact.
Who by?
Well, and by the Conservatives. I sat having my dinner one night with a Conservative who said to me, he says, "Jim, you stand firm." And I always remember this. I'm not going to mention his name. He's a nice guy. I like him a whole lot. But and he says to me, he says, "You stand firm and we'll stand with you." Within less than 24 hours, they had all evaporated.
That's because they had an 80-seat majority. They didn't need you anymore.
Do you feel you were done over by Boris Johnson?
They didn't have the 80-seat majority until the election.
Do you feel you were done over by Boris Johnson when it came to the deal that he got through Parliament?
I think Boris probably regretted what he did, but he did it.
Did he mislead you, do you think?
I would say that he just let us down.
Okay. Alan, just briefly, the question was about United Ireland, just to come back to that before we move on. Do you think that if the DUP don't support this deal, that they will be making a United Ireland more likely?
I think that question is a very complicated one because there are many different factors that go into why there might be either falls or rises in that sentiment, both north and south. Sure. We haven't even spoken about the political system in the south, which has been obviously very unusual for the past few years with the Sinn Féin strength compared to its past. So I wouldn't say that where the DUP sits on this will have a direct impact on this. I think there are complicated factors, and we simplify this at our danger.
Thank you. Ben, briefly back to you, just in a sentence if you would, sir. I wonder what you make of what you've heard.
Well, Well, the Catholic population over the next 20 years will overcome the Protestant population in Northern Ireland. And it was more likely that the Catholics would vote to have a united Ireland. And it's less likely, in my opinion, now because of this, if this agreement goes through. Because
you think it will be a success.
In your pocketbook, you think, well, I'm better off staying where I am.
Ben, thank you for your question. Really good point. We're going to move on from Northern Ireland in just a moment. Karen, I'm going to come to you on your question after the news. The 8:31 is the time here on LBC. Let's get the headlines from Serena Farrow.
200 police officers are searching for the baby of a couple who've been further arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. Constance Martin and Mark Gordon are being questioned by detectives in Brighton, where they were spotted last night, 2 months after they disappeared in Bolton. The Prime Minister says his new Brexit deal creates the world's most exciting economic zone for Northern Ireland. The country has access to both the EU single market and Great Britain's. And nurses in Wales have given ministers 5 days to reply after they rejected the latest pay offer. If not, they'll announce more strike action. LBC, where the light scattered showers tonight, but then dry overnight with a low of freezing.
This is LBC.
Right, we're going to move on from Northern Ireland. Just a reminder, with me in the studio for Cross Question tonight, Jim Shannon, the DUP MP for Strangford, Tessa Dunlop, the historian and author, Alan Mendoza, the Executive Director of anti-extremism think tank, the Henry Jackson Society, and Richard Foord, the Liberal Democrat MP for Tiverton and Honiton. Our next question tonight comes from Karen in Chippenham. Karen, hi.
Hello, Ben. Hello. This is a question about the NHS.
Fire away.
On the question of funding in the NHS, why is so much taxpayers' money seemingly spent on management, bureaucracy and administration, and especially the business operations, and also, in particular, in local NHS trusts, when prioritisation surely should be given to primary care services such as GP services, accident and emergency, the acute hospitals, nurses' salaries, ambulance services and elective surgery and so on.
So, Karen, just in short, you think the NHS is wasting too much money that should be going on patient care?
Well, I think patient care should be surely prioritised. That's what it's all about.
OK, Karen, thank you. Alan Mendoza, is the NHS wasting too much money?
Well, I'm sure it is, because like any bureaucracy, money gets wasted. But then again, it's a massive bureaucracy. This is a giant service that is obviously providing healthcare across the country. It's got to have some management. It's got to have some, sort of setting as to how you deliver these things. It can't just be the frontline services. You have to have the back behind it. I think that the question really is, can we do better? That's really the question. I think all of us understand that there's vast amounts of money going into the NHS. Those vast amounts may not get to the front line. We want them to get there. And therefore, it's a question about how can we best allocate the resources. It's clear, I think everyone is starting to come to the consensus that something's got to change. And just throwing more money in is not going to be the answer unless you have some reform that's going to lead to that. So I think all political parties are beginning to see it. I saw what was very interesting. Labour MP, I think it was Jim McMahon, was saying that he had just had an experience in emergency care where he had felt, I went in there and I realised the system cannot stay as it is. Something's got to change. And I think the more we get to that point, the more we actually have a reasonable chance to solve that problem and actually work out how.
What needs to change, though? Because everyone agrees that it's not working. Something needs to change. What is it?
Well, I think, firstly, it is about looking at how that bureaucracy works with another. I've also been in numerous NHS hospitals where you can see one ward not talking to another. There is a sense of equipment here not being following there. I've got no idea about what systems are in use here or what's going on, but it just is obvious to anyone who's in there that there is inefficiency going on. So, yes, clearly there's an efficiency focus. And we've got to work out how we're delivering those services. Is how the NHS is actually organised today the appropriate way of doing it? Are there better ways of doing it? And should we start relieving some of the pressure? There are all sorts of models around the world, in Europe I'm thinking of particularly, where you've got different areas about GP access, other places. Do we have to start thinking about realistically a grand national project to renew the NHS? I say national because it's going to be very difficult for any one political party to have a go at this.
But I hear you saying it's not about money, but we have to recognise that not just in Britain, across the globe, there is a healthcare worker shortage. And that means actually money does talk, because we need to recruit the best as fast as we can, from care right up to the top surgeons. And if you look at the more successful models in Europe, whether it's France or Germany, they do spend approximately 1 to 2% more of their GDP on their health services. So I would suggest that, you could give your managers a bit less money, but then you might not get such a good manager, because that's a competitive market too. But actually, pounds, shillings and pence, which we've now reverted to in Brexit Britain almost, it does count. And these shortages, and I know this, I'll give you an example. I know this because I spend a lot of time in Romania. They were losing more of their medics that they were training than they were retaining. So do you know how they solved that problem overnight? They raised doctors' and nurses' wages in 2018 by 70%. Bang.
But that's
doctors
not
and nurses.
Tessa. We
can't do 70%. This is coming from a very low wage in Romania. But that's an example of, these were economic migrants. They were looking for a better wage. And what kept them at home? An honest, decent wage. And if now we're looking, since you had austerity, since 2010, you've had these historic wage freezes in the likes of nursing, which are at the coalface. You're never going to win against the nurses. If you don't have people to care for your patients, the NHS at the very front line is already unravelling at the seams, and people are dying. We saw the statistics this week.
Yep. And if you ask nurses why they're striking, yes, partly because of their derisory pay, but they're also striking because of the conditions in which they're working. And a lot of them, I think genuinely, altruistically, they really do care about their patients, and they can see that the system is collapsing around them. We had 40,000 nurses leave the profession last year, and there are 130,000 vacancies across the NHS. So I recognise that this is partly about resources, but it is also partly about stewarding those resources, and for that we need good administrators, good leaders and good managers.
Do you think there is too much wastage, too much bureaucracy at the moment, Richard?
I'm not close enough to it to be able to comment with any authority on that point.
I can tell you that as a mother of 2 children, it's like working a system. It's like doing an MA or something. You have to be good at administration to get your child through, first of all, a GP appointment, to then be told, oh, you better go to A&E because I'm not too sure. That's like a 2-day job. Who has that free time?
We let's face it. None of us are NHS managers or leaders, and we don't know the system well enough to comment with expertise on.
But
the
we are
efficiency.
patient. We see the failures.
We use the system.
Yes, that's true. But I think what stands out above all else, when you talk to the healthcare professionals, and many of them are my constituents, and I do, they will point out to me that there's no prospect of the NHS repairing this worker shortage, this lack of a workforce plan, while the pay settlement for nurses and other healthcare workers is derisory.
Do you think the sort of figures, 19%, 25% junior doctors, are they realistic? Do they need to get a bit more sensible?
There needs to be a realistic amount paid, which is as close to inflation or as close to that as the government can afford. But the fact that the government has not budged and has not even got around the table with these people for so very long is an indictment on this government. When some of these people are so selfless, they have selflessly committed themselves to you and me and society. It's outrageous that the government has not got around the table before now.
Jim, do you agree?
I certainly do, and I'll go further than that. I was very pleased to join the picket line of the nurses outside Harrods Hospital. I joined them because why did I do that? I did it because they were right. I've spoken to Steve Bartley at private conversations that we have. It's always an opportunity to do so. His hands I suspect, were tied by Treasury. I think, to be honest and fair.
Do you think from your conversations he wants to give them a decent pay?
Well, I'm also very, very, very friendly with Pat Cullen, who's the union leader for the Royal College of Nurses, and she's a good girl. I've met her. She's from Northern Ireland, as you know. Our accent with the giveaway on that. But we've had a good conversations. I met her across the bridge there at St Thomas's when she was out speaking. I went across and shook her hand and wished her well, and on the picket line as well. Why did I do that? I did it because the nurses deserve a pay rise which is decent. I suggested this to Steve. Honestly, mate, I said if it was me, I would bring them in. You've refused to talk to them. I mean, why would you refuse to talk to people? Just have the conversations about that's all Pat Cullen ever wanted on behalf of our workers.
Which he's now doing, Steve.
Yeah, but he should have done that 3 months ago. I mean, another conversation I had with another minister, again, I'll maybe keep this name out of this one. He said to me, well, we're coming to a stage now where we can have some talks because we're coming into the new financial year, so therefore we can have a balance of money from this year and then go into the new year. It's all about figures, I suspect, at the end of the day. But justice tells me that the nurses deserve more. The people out in the streets tell me that they deserve more. The ones that I've met deserve more. No, as well. Those ladies I met in Newton Ards and those gentlemen as well, they're genuinely going to food banks to try and survive. A junior doctor's in 29,000. I mean, are you going to tell me? I'm not saying it's not a brilliant wage for a junior doctor who will progress to something better, I understand. But yes, let's get these talks done. And it should have happened ages ago. I'm really disappointed that it didn't. And I think a government, pick your battles. I said to the guys, pick your battles. This is the battle you don't need to fight. Sort it out.
Do you know what I think we're going to see increasingly? It's going to be a return to a period of sort of redistribution like we had post-Second World War under Attlee. 21st century has a resources crisis, war in Ukraine or not. And actually, you're going to see the spivs and the toffs and the moneymakers. They're going to have to be taxed more in the end. And that might be politically very unpopular for the Conservatives to recognise, which is why they're stalling. But in the end, you're going to see those pay differentials, I think, come down.
Okay,
just one
very briefly.
Just want to mention the cost for agency staff is colossal. It's 30% more than a wage of a nurse. If they got that sorted out and employed the nurses, give them the extra money, there'd be quids in.
Jim, thank you. Good question from Karen. Karen, thank you for your question. Lots more to come. Lots more questions coming in. We'll get through as many as we can before 9 o'clock. The time now, 8:45.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
After a wait of nearly 3.5 years, have they finally got Brexit done? Conservative MP and Foreign Secretary James Cleverly.
It was inevitably going to be the case that we needed to put arrangements in place for our trading relationship with the EU. But we could see that it wasn't working. The people of Northern Ireland were telling us that it wasn't working.
What should we think of the person who told us that it would work and it was oven ready? Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Did he let us down?
Boris was instrumental in actually delivering that 2016 mandate to leave the European Union. And if that hadn't happened, a lot of the things that we've been working on would have been moot points anyway.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
.48 the time. Lots of questions coming in for our panel. We'll get through as many as we can. Let's get straight to them. A text question from Jennifer in Great Yarmouth, who says a Tory MP has revealed today that they were sent faeces through the post because of the row over sewage in our rivers. Another criticised the Liberal Democrats for blaming the Tories for this problem. Is the whole issue, Jennifer says, being a bit overblown by the likes of the Lib Dems and the man for the undertones? This is Simon Jupp, Tory MP, who said it's frankly ridiculous that the Lib Dems are blaming the government for sewage in rivers. Is this your fault, Richard?
Well, I think first thing to be said on this is it's absolutely inexcusable for anyone to take that sort of direct action. So I think dreadful that somebody should have received something through their letterbox. Inexcusable. Elected representatives should not be treated like that. Of course, I have absolutely every responsibility to communicate the concerns of my constituents. That's what I'm employed to do. And I get tens of constituents writing to me per month about sewage. It's something that people are really emotive about, feeling really strongly about it, and rightly so. In my patch, we've got the sea at Branscombe, Beer, Seaton, the rivers discharge into the bay at Sidmouth. And people want to be able to go wild swimming, and they are so very frustrated at this Conservative government that is not holding water companies to account for these sewage spills.
Alan, is it fair to blame the government, or is it the water companies themselves that should pick up more of the slack?
Of course they should, and it's a bit like, look, as a local councillor, I've got, slightly different problems to deal with. I've got a big, I might say, a dog poo problem where we are. Is it the council's fault that there's dog, or is it the owners, essentially, who are to blame for this?
It's a bit different, isn't it? Because this is sort of institutional...
Well, it is and it isn't. It isn't, because we know who the culprits are here. It's the water companies who've got to pick up on this. I think the government also needs to work with the water companies and move this issue forwards, and to enable that everyone wants clean water, everyone wants, sewage gone in this sort of way, but to suggest the government suddenly is to blame for what the water companies are doing, yes, there's a direct causality.
They are failing to regulate. They are failing to regulate these water companies.
I think it's more about actually working with them to actually solve this problem. Nobody wants to see sewage and water, do they?
The water companies are taking enormous bonuses, and people find it offensive that South West Water, for example, which has got a 1-star rating on My Patch, is paying its chief executive more than £1 million by way of a bonus.
But I thought a proposal came from the Lords and it was voted down in Parliament, and this was to better regulate the water companies. And I never understood why that was stalled. It seemed like a no-brainer to me. Hit them where it hurts. Get them to behave better.
Should the government do more, Jim?
Well, I think there's a responsibility for government to do more, and while the minister's a very decent person, I think the answers that she gives to the questions in Parliament are not sufficient enough.
Therese Coffey, this is.
Well, there's her and Rebecca Pow. I think there's actually a couple there who answer the questions. I think that the point I'm making is this: at the end of the day, the water companies have a responsibility. They do the mechanical, the physical work of the pipelines and all. The leakages are another example of money being wasted. But yet now we find incredible dividends, as Richard said, and I just think there's something obscene.
But hang on a minute, it's the water companies that are discharging the sewage into the rivers.
Yeah. But government oversees all that, so there is a role for the ministers as well.
Okay.
Has to hold the Northern Ireland or the water companies to account.
Okay, lots of questions to get through. We're going to move on. Next question, another text question from Molly in Birmingham, who says, is Isla Bryson going to a male prison an example of public pressure coming ahead of due process? Tessa?
I think this case forced the Scottish Prison Service, in fact, I know it did, to review their processes regarding transgender prisons. We're talking a very small number, I think something like 12 transgender, I think, identifying as a female transgender prisoners. I think approximately 6 of them were being held in Corton Vale, which is the only female prison in Scotland. Now they've reviewed that so that all transgender prisoners will be held until initially in a prison that represents their gender at birth, until it's been ascertained what they've been convicted for, what their track record is, and any of those with a track record of violence against women will not be held in female prisons. So what Isla Bryson's case has done is it's focused people, politicians, lawyers on the detail, which had been overlooked. So in a way, this case, vile though it is, and I saw she was given a hefty sentence today, has, I think, forced Scottish law and the way in which their prisoners are treated to update. And that's what you would expect. That's what case law is all about. So I welcome it from that point of view. In terms of the way in which it became conflated with the gender reform bill, I felt that was very unfortunate timing from the point of view of the Scottish First Minister. But it actually was irrelevant because she was convicted and she was imprisoned under her chosen gender. The gender reform bill hadn't been passed. It was nothing to do with this new reform bill. It was just a coincidence, and a very unfortunate one from the SNP.
So you don't think this is a result of public pressure coming ahead of due process, as Molly says? You think this is the right
because of the gender reform bill, of course, it made huge headlines on both sides of the border, because we know that we've had the clash with Westminster in the Equalities Bill and Section 35. But it's the right outcome, so it's a good outcome.
Alan Mendoza, do you agree?
It's definitely the right outcome. I mean, the idea that you were going to have this situation where a convicted rapist could be in a place where they could be a threat to women, quite obviously, was a nonsense. It was a non-starter to begin with. It's quite extraordinary, actually, that Nicola Sturgeon's political career, at the end of it, was over this issue, essentially. Yeah, there are other things, of course, but for her to have gone out and, really sort of looked at this issue in the way she did, just as inexplicable, because both from natural justice point of view, from common sense point of view, it was obvious what needed to happen here, and indeed a loophole has now been tightened up.
But to be fair to Nicola Sturgeon, this was a passion project for her for 6 years. And I knew, because I know people who work with Nicola Sturgeon, that she intended to resign before this upcoming election.
That may well be true, but it may be that history teaches you that where you go ends up, the people will go that it's linked, whatever you say on that matter.
65% of the Scottish population were against what Nicola Sturgeon was bringing in. I think she, and I say this respectfully to her, I think she failed to acknowledge that. I think the fact that the SNP have fallen 7% in the polls is an indication of a wrong judgment call. For me, Tessa, it's a quite simple issue. It's about the safety of women. And I will speak up for the safety of women over and over again. So therefore, the decision is the right one.
Richard, do you mind? I just want to address Molly directly on this one. I think, Molly, you're right to have asked the question about women's safety. And sometimes when we draw so much attention to one case, as we do in this case of Isla Bryson, we miss the fact that there are so many rapes and sexual offences committed against women that are going unconvicted every single day. And I think let's not all crowd on this one incident, this one case, and miss the bigger picture, which is unconvicted sexual offences.
I fully accept that, Richard. Do you think this is the right outcome, though? That a trans woman who has a history of violence against women should not be in a female prison?
It's the correct outcome, but I think there is so much heat around this issue when really what we ought to be, while we're discussing this, and politicians, the press are discussing it a great deal at the moment, we're not reporting on, we're not discussing the minuscule conviction rates for rape and sexual offences.
But also there's an awful lot of golf club feminists who are suddenly jumping on this bandwagon. I don't think that they were really concerned about women's safety in Cornton Vale up until this point. And incidentally, Isla Bryson was secluded, so she didn't endanger any woman when she was being held.
In literally a yes or no, please. If there's not a history of violence against women, is it right for trans people to be imprisoned under the gender that they choose? Jim?
I'm not entirely convinced of that. I think not what they choose.
Even if there's no history of violence. Okay, Tessa?
I think it needs to be decided on a case by case. But I think, yes, if there's no history of violence, then it stacks up.
Richard?
Case by case is exactly right, Tessa.
I would also say that because it depends on conditions of the person.
OK, there's a very quick question. This was about the licence fee, the BBC suspending it in the spring to allow people to watch the King's coronation. We're going to have to literally 10 seconds answers on this, please. Is this a good opportunity for it to be stopped for the coronation and then never brought back in again? Should this be the permanent end of the licence fee? Jim?
I think the licence fee probably has a role to play, but I do think that those of a certain age should have some concessions. I think it's important that we do that. I think we all look forward to the coronation. I think it'll be a special occasion.
Richard?
I'm a big fan of the public service broadcaster, but some of the changes it's proposing to local broadcasting probably need review.
OK, and Tessa?
This is about binding hearts and minds. What I want to know is, will Harry and Meghan get a BBC permit in Montecito so they can watch?
What's that got to do with the licence fee?
Yeah.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is, will
they be allowed to? Will they want to watch?
Will they
won't want to come anyway,
That was a clever attempt by Tessa to shoehorn another subject into here. Look, the reality is BBC funding, like NHS funding, is outdated and needs to be resolved in a very different way. I think this should open up a whole debate about where we go with BBC.
OK, that question was from Adrian in Wolverhampton. Thank you. Our final fun question tonight comes from Kerry in Margate, who asked the panel this. An EasyJet pilot did a full 360-degree loop last night while flying to the UK so the passengers could see the northern lights over the North Sea. What natural phenomenon or sight of beauty would you go out your way to see, as this pilot did? Thank you, Kerry, for that. Tessa, put you on the spot.
Wow. I would like to climb Ben Nevis, Alone at Night.
Alone at Night?
Yes, I think because there's so many people. I love Ben Nevis. I love it's the top, the highest. You, Jimmy boy.
Jim will go with
my
you.
goodness.
Brilliant
Look, it's so crowded. It's so crowded up there. All these lycra warriors. And I would like
what
to
about women's
experience
safety?
the top of Britain on my own.
Okay. Tessa wants to climb Ben Nevis by herself at night. Richard?
I would recommend wild camping on Dartmoor.
Is that in your constituency? It's not in your constituency.
It's not my constituency. It's something I care passionately about. It's something where our rights to do so have been infringed lately, and I want to see
I can see the appeal of that. Alan Mendoza.
Great Barrier Reef. For me, it's the ecosystem that's existing there, unique, incredible life, flora, fauna. It's fantastic, and I've not been there. I'd like you said.
There's not much left of it.
Out my way. Well, that's why go now.
Go now. Finally, but last of all, not least, Jim Shannon.
Well, I'm going to be really parochial, so I'm Ben, and I'm going to go for my constituency of Strangford. I live in the edge of Strangford Loch, so I got the most beautiful
But
view
you've already seen it. You don't have to go out your way.
But
you're there every week.
I love going every day to see it. Scrabble Tower in my constituency as well would be another place I'd love to go. Why? Because it's all about the people that I love.
Well, the question was, where would you go out of your way to see? You can't say home.
Well, on my way probably to Florida.
Florida. Okay, we got there in the end. Thank you.
I have to get a wee bit of it Strangford in, you know.
Thank you all. Thank you to our panel tonight, Jim Shannon, the DUP MP for Strangford, Richard Foord from the Liberal Democrats, Tessa Dunlop, the historian and author, and Alan Mendoza from the Henry Jackson Society. Coming up in just a moment, we are going to be talking about homelessness in this country. Figures today reveal the number of people sleeping rough on our streets has increased by a quarter in the last year. If you've been affected by homelessness, if you have been homeless, really want to hear from you between now and 10 o'clock. What happened? What was it like? What support was on offer to you? And what do we do about a problem that seems to just get worse and worse and worse? The housing crisis in this country, I don't think, is being taken seriously by any political party, and more people are ending up on our streets as a result. If that's been you, and if you've experienced this, give me a call, 0345 6060 973. That's next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, a major hunt is underway after the parents of a baby were spotted and further arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter earlier. LBC reporter Emma Call was in Brighton, where they were seen a short time ago.
A helicopter and sniffer dogs, thermal cameras were also being used earlier on, looking for signs of where Constance Martin and Mark Gordon had been and were potentially earlier on, and where potentially as well their almost 2-month-old baby could be found.
Downing Street insists the Prime Minister isn't endorsing single market